Hey there, welcome back to Tacks, our video series on your toughest questions for taking ideas and putting them into action. I'm Nicola, founder of Up With Community, and I'm here today with Professor Kim Simmons, professor at University of Southern Maine's Women and Gender Studies program. Kim, I have been learning from you about feminism, about misogyny, about patriarchy for the last 2 years, really, and I've appreciated the time that you've given me on that. It's really helped develop my thinking, and I'm starting to use more of that in my work. And so that's why I wanted to sit down together and talk a little bit with our Brass Tacks community about how these concepts really impact the change that we're trying to make in the world. But before we do that, tell us a little bit about what you're up to in the world.
Well, I teach at Women and Gender Studies at USM. I mostly am teaching intro, but I teach women in social change, social movements, those kinds of classes, which is really fun. And then I am working with the Women's March Portland on trying to build that, and with the Maine Women's Lobby. And I have 2 daughters that I still love to parent.
You're busy.
Yeah.
You're busy, basically. Yeah. Well, Kim, I have to tell you, I think for a long time, I could not give a succinct definition of feminism. I think I saw a lot about feminism in the world. I was exposed to other people's ideas about what it was, but I didn't really take the time to come up with a definition for myself. So I'm curious, what is your starting point for how to define feminism?
Yeah.
Not that there's one definition.
Right. I think that's fair, because there are multiple
Yeah.
Pathways. And so I think, feminism at its base is about liberation and freedom for all people, including people who are women.
Yeah.
But underneath that, for me, the 2 places are simultaneously trying to think about how we raise the value of the work in the world that's coded as feminine. So things that are nurturing, about care, about empathy, about emotion. To the extent that we don't value that because it's considered part of what it is to be in the zone of women, I think it's important we figure out how to change that, because we actually really need those values to make our communities work. And then at the same time, releasing people who are called women, and that boundary or category can change from being consigned to doing that, or somehow the assumption that it's natural that people who are women know how to do women's work. And so for me, those 2 things are always happening at once. I can't, one without the other feels distorting.
And I remember when you first told me this definition 2 years ago, and my brain got stuck a couple of different times, because a very different way, what you're really talking about is how we show up in the world, how we interact with each other in the world, and these ways that are visible and invisible, or explicit or implicit, of coding.
Yes.
Right? Things as feminine or not feminine. And I was like, oh, I need to look at the world totally differently in order to see this. Because so often I've been taught to think about feminism as equality with men. Right?
Yeah.
Doesn't talk about the gender binary, doesn't really actually allow us to talk about misogyny. Right? All it really says is, when we've got the same thing men have, then we're all good. Right? And that's just not...
Right. And these categories are so big, different than some other ways of organizing around identity. Who are men?
Yeah.
I mean, men is too big of a category, and women is such a big category. And so there's so much difference within those spaces. Equality with which men, in what way, So I think that is a shorthand that's useful sometimes. When there's really clear moments of active discrimination, when the women's soccer team's not paid as much as the men's soccer team, and it feels apples to apples, that's a useful, description.
But there's a lot of places that it doesn't serve us. And I think where you really started to change my thinking was looking at the feminine, because that also then opened up this whole way that I could stop thinking about the gender binary.
Yes. Yeah.
Because there are so many different gender expressions, gender identities that fall under the feminine, or not cis male, masculine, right? And it allowed me to really see the ending of the gender binary not as this threat to all the things that I love about being a woman, but really this freedom and this liberation.
And an invitation, and you have a son.
Yeah, I do.
I think there's a lot of feminist work being done around how much being constricted to denying the feminine is really, really harmful for people called men or people who identify as men, including trans men. You know, that if that includes having to kill off anything that is associated with emotion or with friendship or relationship or care, that's like not good for them. You know, and you work the organization Boys to Men does just around trying to bring that value, of actually boys' mental health, rates of violence, violence against self, violence against others are so often connected to, if anything is, you know, feminine in their presentation, they're bullied and seen as not fully men. Right. And those are traps that are bad for all of us.
Yeah. And, you know, I think the definition, I've also been thinking a lot about, because again, there are multiple definitions, is the one that Leslie Hill offered me a few weeks ago from Bell Hooks, which I had probably read like 20 years ago and forgotten. Right? Which is feminism as the movement to end sexist oppression. Yeah. And that starts getting some of my political gears rolling, right?
Well, and I think that's really important for thinking about collective identity, because like, again, that who are women is such a contested question. We don't have a biological definition of that category. So I think when I talk to students about, well, why would we maintain the category women? Like, if it doesn't really mean anything, it's because we have all this historical experience of sexism. So how will we have the language to address that if we don't have some collective identity to describe it? So really rooting to the response to inequality is and it makes it active.
And for me, in the understanding of a movement to end sexist oppression, we're really centering a conversation about power. So what's really interesting when I talk to people about feminism, and especially when I talk to them about misogyny, and we'll get to misogyny in a minute, they talk to me about people's beliefs about women or individual people's experiences in the economy. Right? And that one moment where this person is clearly not getting paid the same as this person. And what we're not seeing is like the system of power that's actually restricting our behaviors all the time. Right?
Well, and I mean, this is a little bit of a side, but I have been thinking lately about how powerful the anti-feminist movements are. So it's not like they don't exist with agency too. You know, and so they're constantly working to co-opt feminism, to make fun of it, to make us feel uncomfortable with it, to distance us from the powerful part of working together. And so I think there's a lot of ways that it's really hard to talk about feminism as a political effort that isn't confusing or doesn't include
I think that's
on-purpose mistakes about the history.
And I think we see like really chilling examples of this, right? You know, we've had different debates here in Maine in our legislature for legislation that would really help everyone, but that may be focused on issues that impact people who identify as women. And, you know, there have been women standing up, I think pretty much all of them Republican, but it's not about that political party, standing up to say, well, I'm fine, so I don't need this bill anymore. Right? My individual experience is okay, so we don't need systemic change. And I think for anti-feminist movements, that is the powerful candy they're trying to sell, right?
For
like,
sure.
You're okay. And look, you're doing so much better than your mom, right? That's often the thing. Like, look how hard your mom or your grandma had it. Now you're okay.
Well, and also, we might make it a little dangerous for you. If you want freedom and liberation, like, we're going to make that choice kind of dangerous. But if you're willing to work within the zone, we'll provide a little bit more protection. And so it makes me think about, you know, with the suffrage centennial, some of the most powerful anti-suffrage speakers were women who had that sense of losing the protection of the patriarchy is going to not be as good for me. I'll give up creative freedom and, you know, full liberation in order to know I have a safe place to sleep. And we see all these threats of violence against women, and I think that is a really powerful control mechanism that keeps us from being always sure it's safe to venture towards, you know, if we could get to ultimate liberation, sure, but we're pretty sure we're going to get attacked on the path there, and that attack isn't necessarily a risk worth taking.
Well, let's just talk about misogyny, because we've basically been talking about misogyny. And that's what I really realized is a lot of times when I'm talking about the experience of non-binary folks and people who identify as women, what I'm actually talking about is misogyny.
Yeah.
And I love that you turned me on to the book Down Girl.
Yes.
Which is really this book that we'll put in the notes for the video that really is having us look at misogyny isn't what a human being thinks, or it isn't just what a human being thinks about people who identify as women. It's actually the systems of habits, processes, and behaviors that control and restrict everything that is connected to the feminine.
Right.
I think.
And I love her description of that it's about women as human givers. And so men are entitled to women's labor, and society is entitled to women's labor as women, as human givers, as a natural state. So it is me, like, if I deny you my time, then I'm violating what is natural for me as a woman, so I should be punished because I'm not acting in accordance to my natural, what is supposed to be my natural state. And so a person doesn't have to have a sexist ideology to swim in that river.
Well, a person doesn't have to have a sexist ideology to swim in the river that women should be punished for not fulfilling their human giving. I'm getting goosebumps because that's basically like half of the conversations I'm having every week. Is I'm sitting with someone who feels distressed about not being able to do some inhuman level of giving. Right?
Yes.
Because there are these distorted patterns and thinking about what they should be giving.
Right.
And because misogyny is this invisible thing constricting how they are telling themselves they're working and what they're seeing in the world. And so often the reason I want to talk about misogyny is because I think it puts on this somewhat painful light bulb of like, oh, I don't have to make 12 cupcakes today, feel bad that I'm tired, and like, I don't have to feel bad about that my organization doesn't get funded enough money. I can actually step back and see we're not getting the respect we deserve. I don't have the help and supports I deserve. And I don't deserve these things because I'm tired. I deserve these things because I'm human.
Right. Well, and to get really concrete about it.
Thank you, because I get a little up in the air.
Me too, because it is.
Yeah.
But, it makes me, I think motherhood, and then I'll talk about work in a second, but I think motherhood is a place where it gets so challenging because it's so often like playing chicken. It's actually really hard to not see the need met. So we know kids are hungry. And if women are consigned as the ones who are going to fix it, it's really a hard place to be like, oh, well, I guess I'm going to like not do my, part in community if and so if men are given the permission, and I am using binary language, there's a whole other piece, but if men are sort of never called to account for like, are you really all right with kids in your community being hungry? If it's only mothers who are supposed to somehow, by osmosis, know what to do, but then men then have the time and space to have political power, we have these huge gaps. So then women are like, I'll make 12 more sandwiches, because that's the power like available, and then the political power can say, look at those lovely women who love to make the sandwiches. They're having so much fun making their sandwiches. We don't have to pass a bill to like deal with this. They're on it, and we're like, we're dying.
And in this example, it can be people who identify as women, non-binary folks. Like it's anybody who's not accessing that kind of.
Well, and it actually can be men.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing about gender. It can be male bodies, but male bodies or non-binary people. But when we look at cis men who come into these women's spaces, coded women's spaces, they're either super exalted. Like, dude, oh my gosh, you're here making sandwiches, you're so amazing, because it's so special to do women's work, like, because they're not natural women, human givers. Or they're coded as gay, not real men, like, in some way denigrated for being in the care space, and then also isolated. So, in my class, there was a young man who said, like, I don't really fit a lot of these male coded masculine behaviors, but I suffer a lot of consequence for that.
Yeah. And what were you going to say about work?
Yeah, so I have from all this reading, because I'm learning a ton. I mean, there's so much writing happening right now. I wrote a letter complaining about something at work, and somebody wrote back, let's have coffee. And I realized, like, I don't want to give you more of my time. I've written this basically same email about 1,000 times. You don't actually care what I think. Like, do I have to politely, be the checkbox, like where you can say you met with me and then feel disrespected and used? Or do I get to value my own time, And I wrote back, like, I would be happy to be hired as a consultant.
Yeah.
Which they will never in a million years do. But that little bit of, I want to reject the capitalist, like all work being commodified, but then in that way, I become the human giver to my institution.
And I think this is really tricky in progressive movements,
So
where I think folks either have actually never actually studied feminism, but feel like because they're progressive, they must know it, right?
Yeah.
Or studied it like 20 or 30 years ago.
Yes.
And they really don't have like an active analysis of power of what's happening right now, right?
And it's hard, I think it's hard for those of us trained, because it's a little bit that funny feeling of like, when somebody gets their medical information from Goop, and you're like, no, that's not actually, the medicine. And so, so on the one hand, feminism is for everybody. Everybody gets a point of view.
Book. I was thinking the same book. I was like, if there's one book I would want everybody to read, it's like, start with Feminism is for Everybody by Bell Hooks, and then...
Right, but I think that part of, like, people do have very specific personal experiences of gender that are meaningful. But I think Patricia Hill Collins is a social theorist, and she makes the argument about Black feminist thought that it has to be both a subjective experience and in relation to thinking about it. That we build theory through reflection, and there has to be reading, and so it can't just be opinion. And that part is hard for people. That feels exclusive in some way that we've made. So I think it is contested who gets to say.
Well, and I would say I walked around like that person, right? I don't think I actually really had an understanding of what feminism was. And, I would say things in a meeting like, don't worry about this. I'm not going to be touchy-feely. Right?
Yeah,
and you and I had this conversation a few weeks ago where I'm rejecting myself on behalf of others, which is something that my good friend Kathy Kidman reminds me not to do very often. Where, I have all of these ways that I try to protect other people from the feminine in this work that I really had to stop doing. Right? But I can't stop doing that until I stop and reflect. And this is something that's really one of the reasons I wanted to talk with you, is because when I'm trying to do work on race now, I have at my fingertips a lot of articles that are quite accessible in their language and in their framing. And I still struggle to find those feminist articles that are shorter, that are easier, that doesn't have to be a commitment to the full book. You've been sending some great ones my way. And I also often find some really great blog posts on everyday feminism. I still go to that blog really often because they've done a good job of cataloging different topics there. But it is hard because I don't want there to be an intellectualism to the self-discovery. But you're right, the self-discovery has to be in relationship to something else, which is why I think I have to go out of my way to create spaces where we're explicitly talking about feminism and misogyny.
And I think because one thing the Women's March really has brought is a better understanding about sort of thinking about what does intersectionality really mean, because it's such a jargon word. But that space where we get to be different and have different feminisms that help us understand our particular time and place, so it's different over a lifespan, and it's different over different groups, different ways of being, and then thinking about political agendas based on feminism, how to take up the needs of the women who are most directly affected by an issue. So I think there's the feminism that helps us understand our own story better, and then there's the feminism to launch campaigns off of. And they're connected, but they can be different too. So there is a lot. Gender's part of every part of our life. Everything includes gender.
No, I think that's really useful. And as we're talking, I'm reminded of the feeling I had for all of my 20s and into my early 30s of I could hear a little voice in the back of my head saying, you should actually learn something about feminism. It would probably help you. and feeling so kind of unprepared to deal with the pain that was going to come up at looking at that.
Yeah.
And I know you've helped a lot of people through making that transition of like, I'm not thinking about feminism to I am thinking about it, right? And like, what are some of the supports or, you know, what do you offer to people as you see them just wrestling with that pain? Because there was like, you know, for me, there's like 33 years of gunk,
Yes.
you know, that I also had to just be gentle with, be patient with, grieve,
Right.
throw into the forest and then walk away.
Yeah.
Before I could get to the point of talking at this level with you. Like literally, you would come and meet with me every few months for 2 years, and I could not have this conversation until like 2 months ago.
Yeah. Well, I think that that's really real on sort of multiple levels. And one is, I mean, I think the consciousness raising groups of the 70s were really important to building that feminist thinking, you know, theorizing, because people had each other's stories and there became some like space of trust. And we're isolated and lonely as, you know, sort of the bigger picture of current modern life. And so that isolation makes it harder to develop a sense of a theory of how gender matters, because like, who do you talk to? And so I think in some ways it is the book groups and the salons and the like the spaces where people get to meet and just be a little bit more honest about the different kinds of experiences that are connected to gender oppressions, and find out like it's and part of the problem I think is that we got sold the idea that if you were smart enough, you know, strong enough, you could individually cross
Figure it
the
out.
hurdle.
Yeah.
And so if you haven't, it's because you're broken in some way.
And isn't that a message of misogyny?
Yes, yes. And I just think that's what I mean about the other side being strong. They were really effective in selling that message to a lot of people. Yeah. And so it made the movement less strong, and it made a lot of people find the way to address any feelings around sexism or experiences of misogyny was to move away from identifying as a woman in some way, or to take the blame, like to feel. And I do think the Me Too movement is helping us really reflect on, wow, what were the strategies people used when faced with sexual harassment? To quit, to hide, to make it somehow okay. So in the Down Girl book, Manne talks about empathy and our over-identifying with the feelings that men have, our placating and worrying about the feelings of men, and in part because it eases violence, the threat of violence, and in part because men narrate all the stories. Yeah. So when we're so over disproportionately hearing the stories and voices of men, we just come to identify with them better.
Well, and a very patriarchal understanding of education is I need to go to a training or a workshop to be made better, and then I can leave.
Right.
And then I'm good.
Yes.
And for me, that's why a part of me was stunted around getting in touch with feminism, was because I knew that wasn't how I wanted to learn, and I couldn't really figure out a different way, and it felt so weird. I mean, I do this all the time, Kim, but it felt so weird to just say, hey, Kim, would you be my friend and talk to me?
Yeah.
And that was really what opened it. And with
Right.
another friend, Andrea, too, just saying like, hey, could you tell me about this thing? And isn't that such a more feminist way of learning anyway?
Yes.
When it talks
Right.
about choice,
Yeah.
right? So one thing that you really helped me understand is feminism is really about choice, and choice as a pathway to freedom, and that we're not trying to create a new constrictive category or location for people. And so really moving away from those trainings was really helpful.
I think one thing that's hard in the language of choice right now is that also acknowledging choice is so often artificial.
Yeah.
Like, it goes back to my, feed the hungry children.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
It's where I fight the most with my spouse.
Yeah.
Like, it's not actually a choice to leave my kid at school overnight.
Yeah.
So, yes, I'm going to pick her up on time.
Yeah.
If that's the only,
That's true.
so yes, I have a choice.
Well, and choice has been played out as a way for like what I would just call like fake feminism.
Yes.
So I grew up.
Yes.
I literally could be whatever I wanted to be.
Mm-hmm.
I got an education. I could live wherever I wanted, and I did.
Right.
I lived wherever I wanted. I had a job. I paid my own rent. I paid my insurance. I paid for my food.
Yeah.
Oh, I had a lot of people helping me.
Yeah.
Oh, I had a lot of privilege to get there. But there was still this kind of like patriarchal and really white supremacist story of I've made it, and I've made it on my own, and isn't that being a feminist? Right?
Yeah.
While I was pushing away other people who identify as women and non-binary folks to fit in to the system that I wanted to fit into.
Yeah.
Right? And so it was really like both stepping out of that system and then seeking new and different relationships that changed my understanding of power.
And I think it's where people really like speculative fiction right now and science fiction, because it's imagining choices that aren't actually here yet.
Yeah.
And then that's where I think choice, like the space to be fully human involves being different.
Yeah.
And so we do need a lot of choices. Like we are not trying to set just another constrictive path.
Yeah.
But also that recognition, the choices we have now are so limited.
That's very true.
And so,
That's very true.
yeah, when you can make those choices and not have to stuff a whole part of yourself or cover up a whole part of yourself, those will be like more real and fuller choices.
Yeah. You know, and the last thing I want to speak to before we go is the centering of violence.
Yeah.
Because that really opened up for me two realizations. You know, one, the idea of feminism I had been living for so long was incredibly classist, right? And was tied to that white supremacy narrative of you're an individual, you can make it on your own, right? And it really had me shun any understanding of violence, physical, threat of violence, non-physical. And so some of what I've had to do is become more comfortable being able to look at violence in order to have these types of conversations. And it has helped me see something that I had not been taught, but that for me, it's not that racism is here and sexism is here and somewhere they intersect.
Right.
But it's that they're actually mutually intertwined and supporting each other and sometimes the same thing, right?
Absolutely.
And it is that violence that connects them so clearly, right? One book that I'm afraid to read, but that Ben read, is called They Were Her Property. I always add in a 2, but I'm pretty sure the 2 isn't at the end of it. I'll put it in the notes for the video, because it talks about white women's roles during slavery. And I think it really illuminates the intersection of sexism and racism as a shared project.
Yeah. And that violence and it's partly the threats of violence. So we don't have to be the specific victim or survivor to know that if we transgress,
this was going to happen.
So one way we can protect ourselves from the threat of violence is to stay in the box we're put in, and sometimes that is a box of privilege and involves using violence against other people. And so I do think that the overall feminist imagination is trying to understand, like, figure out what would it look like to have a society where there is nobody has the right to use violence to build these social controls. And one thing you've taught me is how to give more language to how do we work within the society we have right now and still maintain that imagination. And I think sometimes the place that gets really stuck or hard is how angry we are at ourselves and each other that we haven't gotten there yet. And so this kind of blaming of women and blaming of feminism for not having achieved what we aspired to. And somewhere in there, in that human giver model, it's all women's fault that we still have racism and sexism and heterosexism. And for sure, it's some women's fault, you know. And it's all of our fault in the way that we haven't given everything else up to do this work, and something in that feels very House of Mirrors, you know, in a way of getting us trapped in being blamed and blaming each other and not being able to step out and look for, are there any bigger systems to fight with than you and me?
I mean, at the end of the day, understanding feminism and misogyny for me has been about clear-eyed seeing. The courage to see that my heart is as wide as the world, as Sharon Salzberg says, that I can take in what I fully see, and that I can find community with others.
And just before we close, I want to say, I think one piece around that connection to violence and self is about using our voices more and speaking what you see more often
That's right.
and with more courage.
That's right.
And Rebecca Solnit, who we all love, has an essay called The Longest War, where she connects state violence and the use of rape as a war tactic all the way through to like why girls don't talk in class. And that articulation about voice and silence, I think when we think about what do we need to support ourselves and each other to do the emotional work of facing the pain, like we need a way to be able to express what makes us angry about our experience without being afraid our families will be, somehow we'll get in trouble with our families or with our friends for saying those truths. And we need a place to be able to practice, to try out telling a story that we don't have to be so fixed and accountable to, that forever that's our one story of ourselves.
Yeah.
So I think some spaces for play with identity and power, you do improv, that's a great place, like trying on just different ways of being and noticing, oh, I never move with that much, take up that much space, I never take up that much space in the world. Why don't I? And what would it be like if I did? And then reminding the cis men in our life, could you ever imagine taking up a little less space? What would that be like? How would that change things? So it's somehow trusting ourselves, like having experiences that help us build more courage to trust that we know that what we think we know, we actually know, and then, daring to make the connection with others.
Whew. Well, thank you, Kim. I appreciated this walk in the woods.
Yeah.
On a winding road.
And it is lifelong learning.
It is.
Like the thing I love the most about this work is there's no getting there.
Yeah, no.
The walk winds and winds and goes up a hill and then you fall down the hill
and somebody
and
slaps
then
you
the
in
thing
the
you
face.
thought you knew wasn't right at all and that's really fun actually. So
great.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kim. I really appreciate it. You can find all of our Brass Tacks videos on YouTube and at upwithcommunity.org.